What if a $60 drone could tear a hole through a $1 billion defense system hidden and win?
At 5:01 a.m., the world above Taganrog does not wake gently. It erupts. A lone 6-pound quadcopter, fragile as a plastic toy, is hurtling through air so cold it stiffens metal. Then the night splits open. A Pantsir S-1 perched on the rooftop roars awake, unleashing 4,200 rounds per minute. A metallic scream that rips through the darkness like a saw through steel. Each tracer is a burning line of fate. Each impact shockwave shakes the drone so violently that its camera flickers like a dying eye. And yet it pushes on. Ahead, the hangar door is closing. Slow, heavy, merciless. The operator has 11 seconds and not a single one is negotiable. Through the narrowing gap, two massive Tu-95 MS. Two bombers glow under pale industrial lights, their curved wings reflecting silver like sleeping beasts unaware of what's coming. Each aircraft is worth $47 million, but their real value lies in the fear they project across continents. A brutal 19-knot crosswind slams into the drone. It drops low, 5 feet above the concrete, skimming over the ground so tightly that the air beneath its propellers becomes a vibrating blade. Another blast erupts behind it, and the shockwave shoves the drone forward as if the explosion itself refuses to let it die here. The operator feels the fight in their fingertips. Every correction is a gamble. Every flutter is a plea. And then, a final burst from the Pantsir screams overhead. The quadcopter lunges, threads the shrinking slit, and slips into the hangar just as the steel door seals shut with a trembling thud. Outside, Russia keeps firing at ghosts. Inside, a different kind of countdown has begun. The instant the lead drone slipped through the hangar slit, the rest of the swarm plunged forward. 18 FPV units, each weighing barely 2.8 kilograms, raced into the most lethal geometry of the entire mission. A battlefield only 240 meters wide, but saturated with sensors, radars, and overlapping fire arcs. The Pantsir S-1, positioned 38 meters above ground level, reacquired the swarm and unleashed its storm. Twin 30mm cannons spun up to 4,260 rounds per minute, pushing out almost 71 rounds every second. Each shell carried a tungsten payload capable of shredding carbon fiber at distances up to 600 meters, and the rolling recoil momentarily lifted the turret by 0.4 degrees, a metric that would matter later. The drones zigzagged between 6 smokestacks, each 46 meters apart and reaching up to 150 feet. Turbulence around them spiked unpredictably. Crosswinds hit 28 to 32 knots, and pressure drops created micro-vortices powerful enough to shove a drone sideways by 1.3 meters in a single burst. One operator watched his drone's IMU register a 2.9 G lateral spike before forcing it under a billboard frame barely 1.1 meters tall. But fire always has limits. After exactly 29.4 seconds of continuous fire, the Pantsir's barrels overheated to 337 degrees Celsius, triggering the autoloader's mandatory pause. The weapon needed 13.2 seconds to cycle fresh belts, an unintentional gift to the attackers. Russia filled the gap instantly. The Kasuga-4 electronic warfare module ignited with a surge of 1.78 megawatts, flooding the 900 megahertz, 2.4 gigahertz, and 5.8 gigahertz bands, with interference powerful enough to trip nearby voltage regulators. Security lights blew out. FPV screens dissolved into walls of static. Telemetry dropped from 60 Hz to 0 in under 0.12 seconds. One drone, blind and drifting, clipped a steel ventilation shaft and vanished. But the rest adapted faster than expected. Their radios began frequency hopping 20.4 times per second, scattering micro packets upward. At 1,585 meters altitude, The relay drone caught each fragment and rebuilt a clean, laser-linked data stream. Just ahead, the hangar door reached 52% open. At 5:05 a.m., 11 surviving drones slip beneath the half-open hangar door and enter a world where physics itself becomes the enemy. The interior air is a chaotic vortex, dust spiraling at 22 feet per second, pockets of negative pressure forming near the rafters, and cross currents strong enough to tilt a drone by 15 degrees without warning. Each FPV platform fights to stay upright, burning through its battery at 8% per minute from constant micro-corrections. Russian ground crews freeze for a split second. Then chaos ignites. A soldier fires a burst of 5.45 by 39mm rounds, but at distances under 20 meters, the ricochets rebound unpredictably off steel beams, sending sparks across the concrete floor. Another guard shoulders an Igla S, but with a minimum engagement range of 500 meters, the missile system is powerless in a room barely 90 meters long. The drones ignore the gunfire. They are after chemistry. The first FPV slams into a rack of industrial oxygen cylinders positioned 3.4 meters below the left wing of a Tu-95 MS-2. The shaped charge ignites a thermal jet exceeding 3,700 degrees Celsius, slicing open both the cylinders and the aluminum wing root. Above it, 19,500 gallons of JP-8 stored in the wet wing begin to vaporize. When the fuel encounters the oxygen-rich plume, ignition is instantaneous. The explosion is not sharp. It swells. A pressure wave of 38 pounds per square inch rolls across the hangar, knocking tools, crates, and personnel off their feet. Heat rises fast, 85 degrees Celsius, 92 degrees Celsius, 100 degrees Celsius in under 30 seconds. Drone 2 targets the maintenance trolley nearby, holding 3 KH-55M airframes. The solid propellant inside the nearest casing ignites, burning with such intensity that the concrete beneath it fractures. In seconds, the bomber's structural spine begins to fail. The destruction has only started. 94 seconds before the first explosion shook Hangar 3, the entire operation balanced on a detail so absurd it bordered on negligence. The Bereyev aviation plant, responsible for nearly 27% of Russia's strategic bomber modernization, still protected its hangar doors with a factory default 6-digit code. No biometric gate, no rolling encryption. Just a static sequence still listed in its 2012 maintenance manual. Ukraine's reconnaissance units confirmed the weakness using a combination of intercepted maintenance logs and thermal camera patterns showing no keypad wear except on the numerals 0, 4, 7, and 8. The door's actuator motor required 11.6 seconds to complete a full lock cycle. The strike team planned to exploit exactly 7.2 seconds of that window. The cost of the attacking force? 22 drones. Total procurement cost $13,450, with an average unit price of $611, less than the cost of a single replacement tire for the aircraft inside. But the environment was hostile from the start. Air temperatures over the Sea of Azov hovered at -6 degrees Celsius, pushing LiPo internal resistance up by 17% and reducing total flight time by nearly 21%. To compensate, operators limited altitude to 8 to 9 meters, skimming water so closely that radar beams from coastal stations refracted over them. Their RCS signatures stayed below 0.018 square meters, smaller than a gull. 3 days earlier, software engineers fed 72 hours of Taganrog traffic footage data into a biomimetic pathing algorithm. The goal? Simulate motion patterns of the region's cormorant flocks. Instead of flying in predictable formations, the drones drifted in asymmetric waves, mimicking birds adjusting to shoreline gusts. Russian thermal operators labeled them as avian clutter and dismissed the heat signatures. The flaw should have been caught. The door code should have been changed. But because it wasn't, 11 drones would soon enter the hangar, and a multi-million-dollar bomber fleet was about to face consequences calculated down to the second. While the hangar descended into fire, the air defense grid outside finally awoke to the scale of the intrusion. At 5:02 a.m., 3 miles from the Bereev perimeter, the 91 N6E2 radar, a system designed to track hypersonic weapons at altitudes above 25 kilometers, filtered out sea clutter and locked onto the swarm. But it did not see 22 drones. It saw a single, dense object with an apparent radar cross-section of 0.46 square meters, almost identical to a low-flying cruise missile. The S-400 battery acted instantly. A 40 N6M interceptor, weighing 1.85 tons, blasted from its launch tube. In just 2.2 seconds, it accelerated past Mach 6.3, covering nearly 2.8 kilometers before the operators even blinked. The missile cost roughly $1.9 million, fired at a cluster of plastic and fiberglass worth less than $620 per unit. But speed created its own curse. The missile overshot the swarm by 127 meters, triggering its proximity fuse. The resulting blast hurled a shockwave of 5.4 psi, enough to snap the carbon fiber arms of 4 drones and flip another into the waves below. 5 pilot screens blinked to black. The remaining drones reacted instantly. Their onboard processors initiated fragment ghosting, splitting the swarm into 9 microclusters, each drifting apart at 11 to 14 meters per second. The radar signatures shattered like a mirror dropped on concrete. The S-400 recalibration cycle, normally 1.6 seconds, was too slow to reacquire anything smaller than 0.02 square meters. Within that narrow window, 13 drones crossed the outer perimeter fence. By 05:03:41, they had entered the Pantsir's primary engagement ring, the last defensive layer protecting Hangar 3. And inside that hangar, the firestorm had already begun reshaping metal, melting concrete, and erasing decades of aviation engineering. The air defense network had fired millions worth of missiles, but the battlefield was tipping, not toward the systems built to stop the attack, but toward the machines built to slip through their blind spots. By 5:04 a.m., the Tu-95 MS-2 inside Hangar 3 was no longer an aircraft. It was a heating vessel inching towards structural failure. The explosion triggered by Drone 1 had ruptured 7 meters of the left wing root. Vaporized JP-8 began pooling into the rafters, mixing with oxygen-rich turbulence generated by the shattered cylinders below. Temperatures surged past 110 degrees Celsius, high enough to soften sealants, warp electrical conduits, and trigger microfractures along the bomber's internal spars. The hangar's thermal alarms, rated for 95 degrees Celsius thresholds, had already melted into thin ribbons of plastic. Drone 2's strike on the KH-55M maintenance rack accelerated the collapse. The exposed solid propellant burned at nearly 4,000 degrees Celsius, sending a vertical plume upward at 22 meters per second, punching through a lighting array and weakening a roof truss by 31% in under 10 seconds. The concrete beneath the propellant charred, then cracked, then split open along a 1.4-meter fracture line. The bomber's starboard wing, the one still intact, was now carrying asymmetric heat stress. Aluminum begins losing half its tensile strength at 205 degrees Celsius. Inside the hangar, pockets of air had reached 228 degrees Celsius, and the load-bearing ribs running through the wing began to sag. A groan echoed through the building, deep and metallic, like the sound of a ship tearing against a rock. Then the failure arrived. The starboard wing buckled first, collapsing under its own weight. The NK-12 MP engine, a 5.3-ton mass of alloys and rotating machinery, detached from its cradle mounts and crashed onto the floor, flattening 2 workbenches and rupturing hydraulic lines. Kerosene spilled into the growing inferno, feeding a fire that now stretched nearly 38 meters end to end. The Tu-95 MS-2 was no longer repairable. It was becoming molten geometry, an aircraft dissolving into a shape unrecognizable even to those who built it. And outside the hangar, the second bomber was already feeling the heat. When the fires finally died, Hangar 3 no longer resembled a place where aircraft were built. It looked more like a geological cross-section, Layers of twisted alloys, blistered concrete, and engine fragments fused into a single unrecognizable mass. The Tu-95 MS, two bombers inside, once symbols of long-range power, now existed only as shapes pressed into ash. Outside, emergency crews sprayed foam across glowing puddles of JP-8, while engineers tried to tally the losses. Some costs were simple: tens of millions in destroyed airframes, millions more in tools, jigs, and calibration equipment burned beyond recovery. But the hidden cost, the one that couldn't be extinguished with water, was time. This facility handled nearly a third of strategic bomber upgrades. With its infrastructure crippled, Russia's modernization timeline had just been pushed back by over 18 months. Across the border, the Ukrainian operators recorded the last telemetry logs. Their entire mission, planning, equipment, swarm control, AI routing, had cost less than a single replacement tire from the bomber they destroyed. A handful of small drones had erased what heavy missiles, large fleets, and traditional assaults could not: the illusion of invulnerability. And this is the unsettling truth war planners now face. You can armor steel, encrypt codes, and harden bunkers, but you cannot outspend ingenuity. Sometimes it only takes one overlooked password and a pilot who refuses to blink. So now I'll ask you, after seeing how a swarm this small shattered a fortress this large, what do you think the next weakness will be? Let me know your thoughts below.